And welcome back to our third week of Chowder and Chat. I hope you've enjoyed so far the meal, and want to once again do a shout out to the kitchen crew for their hard work. Thank you so much. And for all those who donated pastries as well, so that we'd have, I don't know if it's a Lenten meal, I guess when it originally started years ago in the 80s, they didn't have desserts, but we kind of changed that, you know. Always good to do some changes. So I hope so far as we have been going through this, I know sometimes history can, maybe isn't our favorite subject, but I know I can say personally in doing a little bit of this study, and it's not an extensive study by any means, but just kind of doing this overview, I've learned so much. And I think that is great in that it helps me as a pastor to understand the various parishes of Falmouth and to address that, because the more we know about our history, I think that can definitely influence our future. So today we're going to talk about St. Patrick's Church. As mentioned, St. Patrick's Church was originally, and I love this picture, I think I said that last week, was originally a mission. Now you got to get this straight, you know, remember how they keep going back and forth? Well, St. Patrick's was a mission or a chapel of St. Joseph's Parish in Woods Hole, which is the mother church. That land was purchased by Father Cornelius McSweeney, who was pastor of St. Joseph's back in 1896. And Bishop Matthew Hawkins, who was the Bishop of Providence at the time, remember, Fall River Diocese didn't exist at that time, gave permission for the chapel of St. Patrick to be built in 1899. It was a simple wood frame structure that cost $5,000 to build. Every time I walk upstairs, I think of that. Another building on the Heights, just as a kind of a way of review, a social or a dance hall, was rented in 1918 by the third pastor of the mother church, St. Joseph's, Father Thomas Kennedy. And the first Mass was celebrated there on the 4th of July, 1918. 3 years later, in 1921, the now Fall River Diocese purchased the hall, and St. Thomas Chapel was born. Now, St. Thomas Chapel was established as a parish on June 3rd, 1928, with Father James Coyle as the first pastor. St. Patrick's Chapel, downtown, became the chapel of St. Thomas Parish. Following me on this? It's fascinating. I didn't know any of this. In 1931, so that's only a matter of 3 years, in 1931, there was a reconfiguration of the parishes and the chapels once again. Father James Coyle, who had come to Falmouth in 28 as pastor of St. Thomas Parish, was now the pastor of St. Patrick's Parish and the chapel of St. Thomas. St. Thomas Parish was suppressed, in other words, and the parish became St. Patrick's. The railroad line, remember we talked about the Shining Sea bike path? The Old Colony Railroad would be the boundary line between St. Patrick's Parish and St. Joseph's Parish in Woods Hole. So you got that? Once again, like there was at St. Thomas we talked about last week, there was no rectory. But this time, rather than renting, I think he got sick of moving, and he said, we're going to have a rectory. And a rectory was built adjacent, the present rectory of St. Patrick's. As the number of people grew, more masses were now added to both the main church, St. Patrick's, and the chapel, St. Thomas. And there was another need for another priest. And so Father Coyle was assisted by the first curate or assistant, Father John J. Griffin. In 1937, Father Coyle purchased, I don't know if you remember this one, the Jarvis property. It was adjacent to St. Patrick's Church. I'm guessing, if someone can correct me on this, I'm guessing probably the present parking lot to the right of St. Patrick's, where the parking lot is today. In the front. Right, and then behind it was they started a parking lot because people were bringing these new machines to church. They needed now a parking lot. So behind the Jarvis house, the Jarvis property, they started had a parking lot. Father John Kelly, who's on the right there, became pastor in 1938, and during his time as pastor, the parish continued to grow, so much so that there was a need to expand the capacity. The little chapel, that cute little picture I showed, couldn't house it anymore. And so the seating capacity was doubled, a large extension having been constructed to the rear of the church. So now if you imagine St. Patrick's original church, they pushed it back away from the street, and that became now the main body of the church. That's why you start getting this very long and narrow look at St. Patrick's. The church was beautifully appointed with a main altar, side altars, and a reredos that was all carved of wood. The refurbished church was blessed by Bishop James Cassidy, which we saw in the earlier picture, on May 15, 1949. In spite of the increase in size, the overcrowding was as bad as ever. St. Thomas Chapel was also bursting at the seams. And so in 1949, 2 sections were added to the sides. So you can see it on the photograph. That's why when you look at St. Patrick's, it kind of has the irregular A shape and then flat areas. My understanding at one time, those were open pavilion areas that they used to kind of protect the people who were outside, weren't able to get into the church for Mass. So they basically enclosed those in. Now, this is the exciting part of today's presentation, I think. St. Patrick's was also blessed to have a number of religious sisters serving the community. So Father Kelly requested that religious from an order known as the Missionary Servants of the Most Blessed Trinity would come and assist in the catechetical formation of the children. Sister Elizabeth Marie was the first one in 1947, and they lived at Our Lady of Assumption in Osterville. Okay? So we're not talking about around the corner. Remember this. Remember this. Came from Osterville and had to commute from there each day. A number of religious sisters served in the teaching religious education of the children of the parish. And this is where I got very excited, because I'm looking at this book, the history, St. Patrick's history. They came out with a book a number of years ago. And all of a sudden, I see this. And I said, I know this lady, I think. Well, this woman, this sister, happens to be with us today, Sister Ann William. And my association with Sister Ann goes back to prior to coming to St. Anthony's. I was pastor at St. Mary's in Mansfield for 8 years. And Sister Ann at first coordinated some of the religious education program and had been doing so since the late 80s. And then towards the end of my stay there, she coordinated all the visitation of all the sick in the parish. And so certainly gone but not forgotten. I was just amazed and want to thank you, Sister Ann, for your service to the children of St. Patrick's. So Sister Ann was saying there was about 1,000 children at the time
At St. Patrick's.
at St. Patrick's.
But Otis was in full operation.
Excuse me?
Otis was in full
Okay,
operation.
now that was part of it, Otis. Because Otis was in full operation, that's why these numbers at the time swelled to the numbers that they were to get today. But if you stop and think, and that's, again, we have to keep addressing changes and needs. At that time, 1,000 children at St. Patrick's. Right now, we have at St. Anthony's 175. St. Elizabeth's has 66, and St. Patrick's has 77. So can you begin to see why we need to start working together? Because we put the three parishes together, you add those numbers up, and it's not 1,000. And so we can be stronger when we work together, and that's part of our goal of this collaborative. So in 1964, and I want to once again thank Sister Ann and her secretary, which I call her secretary, Helen. Helen has been a great friend of St. Mary's Parish, a good friend of mine, and certainly a wonderful friend of Sister Ann. So she's like the secretary when I was secretary to the bishop, and I had to bring them around and spend time with them, but it was also grace time. Yes. Grace time to be able to be with people of great faith. So thank you, Helen and Sister, for being here. So in 1964, under the leadership of Father James Gleason, then soon to become Monsignor, the church was again enlarged, and here we go, adding another 300 seats, which extended towards now, they couldn't go back anymore, so they went front. So they went towards Main Street. One parishioner called it the church that grew to the street. The basement was excavated and built and utilized, and this was at the time when changes in the Mass of Vatican II, as we know, so an altar was made facing the people. Okay? So that's another renovation that we're talking about. So that is the new fronted, but wait, there's more. That was in 1964. So now, for someone who wasn't from the area, and I drove down Main Street and I said, that's an odd church, that St. Patrick's. It's got the steeple in the middle of the church. Well, remember, it wasn't the middle of the church when it was first built. It was the front of the church. So they pushed that church out. So I think Father Tim said that the steeple today would be more or less around the back row of the front section of St. Patrick's Church, where the cross aisle is. That would have been the front of the church originally. Okay? In 1972, the present parking lot with its Queen Street exit, which I love because I use that a lot when I'm going down to St. Patrick's, was built. St. Joseph's Cemetery, as you recall, at the time of the establishment of St. Patrick's Parish, became a part of St. Patrick's, although they did not change the name, because remember, St. Joseph's Cemetery was originally the cemetery of St. Joseph's Parish in Woods Hole. The next year, St. Joseph's Cemetery was enlarged. A house on that property was moved by horse and rollers through the fields down what is now Beagle Lane. Beagle Lane is a small lane that begins as a regular paved road and then becomes a dirt road right to the right of the T-ticket post office. And if you go down that road, as I did 2 days ago, and it comes to the end, that is the back property of St. Joseph's Cemetery. So it's a huge plot of land. Now, they said there was a house on that property, and it was deposited at 124 T-Ticket Highway. A piece of granite from this house is said to have been used at Arlington National Cemetery for the grave marker of John F. Kennedy. Now, I tried looking for that house, and I'm not sure, and if someone knows, you can tell me. But the best I can come up with, it would have been directly across the street from the entrance to Falmouth Mall, which would be that housing development that's in the back. I don't know what the number of that housing development is. All right, so it's right in that area. So there's a possibility that that house is still in existence. I tried looking on Google Maps and things, and I just couldn't check. But I'm going to go by driving without.
That house is on Fresh Pond Road now, I think.
They moved it?
I think that's the same one because it's in that area.
Okay.
Brawl lives there, and that house been moved to Fresh Pond Road.
So the house possibly moved to Fresh Pond Road.
Those apartments, one 100, the other's 138.
Right.
Was in between the two.
Okay.
So I think that's the one.
Okay, so the house, and I'll check that out, rather than being destroyed, apparently was moved to Fresh Pond Road. So that house has certainly gotten around. The old Jarvis house that we talked about earlier, that was rented to the town as a senior center. And in the late 70s, the house was razed because of structural problems. And then in 1973, once again, there was a refurbishment of St. Thomas Chapel. Elevated to as Prelate of Honor, Monsignor Gleason, after serving 23 years as pastor. In those days, priests stayed for a generation, retired. St. Patrick's once again had an extensive renovation in 1999, and that was under the pastorate of Monsignor John Reagan. And most notably for that renovation in '99 was the altar area. Beautiful, beautiful. To this day, that is in most intact. And also the two foyers on the west side of the church, those two entrances, with the parish offices originally, as part of that renovation, were behind the church. Now that's located in the basement of the church. So as you can see, St. Patrick's has a wonderful, rich history. As someone mentioned to me earlier, the Portuguese immigrants that came into town weren't the only immigrants. The Irish immigrants were there. So the town has always welcomed new immigration and has adapted to the change by establishing churches, by providing, keeping the cultures of those churches, of those parishes, intact for the people that have come. And we're going to see that in detail next week as we talk about St. Anthony's Church and its development as beginning as to appeal to the Portuguese community, Portuguese immigrants in the area. So that's about it. I hope you join us next week. That will be St. Anthony's, and then we have a couple of ideas going forward. So thank you all very much. What's the story in the kitchen? Nothing available? You ate us all out of house and home, so we're also feeding the workers upstairs so that they'll do a good job. Okay, thank you all very much.